Hi guys, so today I'm going to be speaking about how Aboriginal activists brought a big change to Australia. In the 1960s, there was the most important era for the Aboriginal people, saying a lot of historians if you've read a few books. It brought a lot of attention to the government about the Aboriginal issues needed badly to be looked at and changed. It came impact great lives and impacted a lot of great lives in the Aboriginal community. A lot of people were killed and also a lot of people uprised the Aboriginal people. So today I'm going to be talking to you about basically who were these people who actually basically made a big change into Australia and what they made the Aboriginal people have the rights that every other race needs to have basically. So today I'll be speaking to you about Charles Perkins. Perkins was born in 1935 in South Australian town of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, and his mother, Erentina, if I'm saying it wrong, please let me know. And his father was Callerton. His mom was Aboriginal, his father was Irish, but basically he was half caste. Some people, and back then in 1960s, the word half caste was just like, oh my god, half caste. But basically it's something now, even nowadays, you shouldn't be saying, as I was taught. So yeah, he was born into a big family with 11 brothers, and also he had sisters. Although he was... Hi guys, so today I'm going to be speaking about Aboriginal activism brought change to Australia and how it changed Australia as we know it today. It was about half a century ago, in the middle of the baby boomers generation, where a landmark were wagged and won by the Aboriginal people. In 1960, Aboriginal people achieved citizenship. That basically meant that they were part of Australia. Well, the Caucasian people then knew them as Australians. They finally got financial assistance and were equally paid. They also learned their rights to preserve their culture and heritage, so they were able to practice their culture, their heritage, and all that other stuff. This was due to Indigenous activities and Indigenous activists like Charles Perkins. Charles Perkins was an Aboriginal sports figure and activist. He began to play in the 1950s in Adelaide in Port Listers. In 1951, he was selected for South Australia's under-18 representative team. He went on to play in a number of teams in Adelaide International and United. In 1957, he was invited to trials in the English First Division team in Liverpool, and that was basically him playing soccer. He had a big sports background, and when Perkins had a physical confrontation with an reversed grade manager after being called a kangaroo bastard. After Perkins' incident, he left Liverpool and moved to Wigan. So when he was in Liverpool, while he was going through the game, someone called him a kangaroo bastard, and to him he took it a little personal. So when he came back he didn't play anymore, and he decided to come back to Australia, and he lived in a town called Wigan, where he worked as a coal miner and a Mosul Commons miner, and also worked in the rugby league as a coach. Perkins played two seasons of rugby in Auckland in between 1957 and 1959. In 1959, Perkins returned to Australia and trialled for Manchester United. On returning to Australia, Perkins appointed captain and coach of the Adelaide Croats, and the Croats, who played alongside the notable Aboriginal figure Gordon Briscoe and John Martyr. Charles was an Aboriginal sports figure and activist. Charles was the first Aboriginal to graduate in the University of New South Wales with a Bachelor of Art. His mother was part of the lost generation, and his father was Irish. So basically he was half, we wouldn't say the word half caste now because some people get offended, but he was mixed race. He was married and had 2 kids. His education. He studied at St. Francis College of All Aboriginal Boys College and furthers his education at the University of New South Wales. In 1965, he became key member of Freedom Right, a bus tour by activists protesting against discrimination against Aboriginals. So this bus tour was basically based full of Aboriginal activists who just who went around telling people about how it's wrong and all those other sorts of things. In a small town of New South Wales, which was inspired by the US Civil Rights Freedom Right campaign in 1961. This aimed to expose the aim for this was to exposure of this discrimination that was happening in the 1960s, and they were trying to stop it. The aim for them was to educate health conditions among the Aboriginal people. So they wanted to upgrade the health, the education, so that the Aboriginal peoples had more opportunities. The tour targeted Wallegett, Moore, and Kempsey. They accused to the public act of both discrimination. This displayed freedom right activities in Wollongong. A local RSL, in one of the tours, a local RSL refused to enter the Aboriginals due to a service. So when they were in the tour, one of the RSL groups was just basically just took a golf club and refused the Aboriginal people to get inside because they thought like they were that rule was basically it had been there for 40 years, and for them to change it was a bit awkward. A man who served in war, fought in World War II, said at the stage during the riot, the protesters ran off the road. They were being run off the road basically. In response to this, they threw eggs and tomatoes to the wall. They threw eggs and tomatoes at them, and this was broadcasted all around Australia. Under the pressure of the public, the council revoked the ban, and the Freedom Right moved on, trying to remove the Aboriginal people, all the bans in the Aboriginal people. On the 20th of February 1965, Perkins and his parties tried to go swimming at a swimming pool that they were banned in. And so growing up for Perkins and his brother was pretty bad in the 1960s. A lot of discrimination and racial comments were just being thrown at Perkins and his family. His brothers, mind you, went to St. Francis all boys schools, and they studied there for basically the whole life. Him and his brothers who were having such a hard time there. They were always being racially, like, people had a racial comment about them no matter what, basically. And for any child growing up, that would be pretty harsh. I mean, I for an example, had been through that type of stuff as well. So for him, when he was in St. Francis, he realized that he had a talent for soccer. So he then thought, okay, I'm initially not going to think about all these discrimination things happening around me. And he initially just focused on and trained as hard as he could. And then he played for an English professional club in 1957, and returned to Australia within Adelaide in 1961. Charles was educated at St. Mary's in Alice Springs, and then moved into St. Francis House in Adelaide at the age of 10. After that, he went on to study at the Metropolitan Business School in Sydney, in the University of New South Wales, and he graduated with a Bachelor in Art in 1965. The first Aboriginal man to ever graduate. So this was like a remarkable thing to happen. Basically, people straight away just thought, oh my god, an Aboriginal person graduating with a bachelor, not even like a cert, but like a bachelor. So that was pretty big for them as well. So that put the Aboriginal people out there. So people still looked down on them, but at the end of the day, they knew that they had their own capabilities, basically. And with a bachelor and he was put into the history books. While studying at the university, he also worked part-time cleaning toilets in South Sydney, and he also worked at a Fitter Tenor, and it's like a company where they, that back in the 60s, how they had to like clean your shoes and stuff like that. He worked at that from 1952 to 1957. His public life. In 1965, he became an activist. He was involved in the Freedom Rider. The Freedom Riders Act was basically, their aim was basically to enhance Aboriginal health, and he also enhanced Aboriginal education to make the government have an awareness on Aboriginal people, to since no one actually even had an awareness to them. So the Freedom Riot bus tour was Charles Perkins was one of the leaders, the main leaders, and one of the incidents that happened while they were touring around the New South Wales was that they went into an RSL club and they got kicked out because there was a rule in that RSL club for 40 years that no black fella was meant to go inside that place, and basically they got thrown eggs at them and thrown across the street. This was said by a veteran that was in the RSL club. So this built up a lot of controversy in the public. So basically, the public started seeing that, government saw it as well, which was basically what the protesters wanted at the end of the day, and this led to them unbanning the 40-year thing. So the aim was basically also happening while the whole tour was happening. So they were actually making some big remarks, even though it wasn't intended in some other way you could say. One of the other incident that happened was one of the other rules that were uplifted was that Aboriginals weren't allowed to swim where any Caucasian person was swimming, in other words. But the activists appealed again with the council and lifted the ban permanently. Charles Perkins was instrumental in the 1967 referendum, as he and his company Foundation of Aboriginal Affairs advocated a yes vote. 90.77% of people voted yes, and allowing the inclusion of Aboriginal people in constituents, which is I think it's a vote basically, and it's allowing the Aboriginal people to get into Parliament basically and have a say in Aboriginals' affairs. This post-referendum era, Charles Perkins was the first senator introduced into the Parliament. In 1977, he worked as a public servant called a Liberal country colonization government in Western Australia. He called one of the country's colonization government as a racist redneck and was suspended and alleged improper conduct. So basically here we see that Charles Perkins basically has a big passion about his work and his Aboriginal people. In 1981, he was appointed permanent secretary of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and the first Aboriginal to become permanent head of the federal government, and he served the chairman Aboriginal Commission for between 1981 to 1984. Throughout this career, he was treated from critical Australian government policies and Indigenous affairs, reowning them. In 1989, Charles became Council of Central Australia. In 1989, Perkins was elected Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, and he represented basically all the Aboriginal kinds of Aboriginals that they are. Charles Perkins caused outrage in many different quarters of society. In May, he declared that the rugby, football, and soccer league were basically was an act of racist in a manner of high level. Due to an outspoken, passionate nature and lack of regard to rules or ideas, we should all aim to upraise Australia. And this is basically a lesson that Charles Perkins has basically showed us, a passion to stay determined to make a big difference in like Australia, like what he did, or in any other thing that you want to do in life basically. And that's what we learned throughout the 1960s with all the activists. They all had an objective, and the objective was to make the Aboriginal people have a say and also have a better education and health within Australia, because this Australia at the end of the day was their land.